The fleet's sensors resolved Curveth Station out of the black, and the first thing Intelligence Officer Queth saw was the flag, a maintenance jumpsuit, orange, stitched into a banner and run up the primary communications mast like a challenge. The second thing she saw made the bridge go quiet. All 40 Guthari guards, every last one of them, unaccounted for. Elias Burke had arrived 9 weeks earlier as cargo. His intake form had read one line: ornamental domestic labor, Terran male, 41, low threat. He had tended frost lily beds under the low, sweet gravity of Empress Seravis's private estate at Kyle Vorath. When the Guthari syndicate had offered a favorable tariff on iridium crystal, the Empress had signed his transfer contract without looking up from her tea. He was a line item. The fleet had come to collect his bones. They would not be collecting his bones. The air in the frost lily beds of Kyle Vorath 6 months earlier had tasted of copper, cold ozone, and cut sap. Elias Burke stood in the pale violet light of a triple sunrise, with a pair of pruning shears in one calloused hand and a slow, considering thought behind his eyes. He was 41 years old. He was almost bald. He had shoulders that had once been broader and hands that had once done crueler work, and he wore the pale grey coveralls of an estate labourer over a body that had, in Guthari calibration units, no business existing at all. He was deadheading spent blooms. He had been deadheading spent blooms for nearly 6 years. The garden he tended did not exist anywhere else in the known systems. The Empress had commissioned it from the ruined moon of Aethrol, and the frost lilies fed only on light, frozen in ionic crystal, and grew only in soil balanced to a chemistry no living plant remembered. It was a garden of ghosts. Elias treated it the way his mother had once treated her seed potatoes, back when the winter had come early and their heating unit had failed and everyone in the house had eaten cold and lived. He treated it with the gentle, ferocious patience of a man who understood that living things sometimes decided to keep living out of pure spite. Above him, on the terrace of pale bone glass, the Empress Seravis was taking counsel. Her true name was a 4-tone harmonic chord that no human throat could produce. The estate's translation matrix, gently and without apology, had compressed it into a 2-syllable sound that a human ear could carry. She was tall. Her scales caught the triple sunlight in a way that made her look like she'd been carved out of the surface of a cold lake. Her attendants were arranged around her in ordered rings. She wore, at her throat, the woven metal collar that marked her as ruler of one of the last surviving matriarchal houses of the Third Reach. She did not look down into the garden. She had never looked into the garden. She had bought the garden the way a person buys a painting. Elias, who understood this, kept working. He had learned in his life that being invisible was the only thing more useful than being armed. Above him on the terrace, a new figure joined the ring of counselors. He wore Varathi silks and a false humility and a face like a fine blade freshly oiled. His name was Vethrak. He carried the title of Trade Observer, which the Empress's court had accepted without checking, because a Varathi trade observer with clean papers was such a boring thing that no one bothered to check. Vethrak was here to move iridium crystal. That, at least, was what he said. Elias, 20 meters below on the garden path, snipped a dead bloom. He had heard Vethrak's voice for the first time 3 weeks earlier. He had catalogued it. He had catalogued the man's shoulders, the way he held his hands behind his back, the small tell of his left thumb tapping against his right wrist when he lied. Elias catalogued the way other men breathed, the way other men catalogued the weather. It was not a talent. It was the residue of a life he had put down. On the terrace, Vethrak was speaking to a person he was not supposed to be meeting. He was speaking to a hooded envoy of the Threshold faction, a splinter movement that the Empress's own house had put down 2 decades earlier, at great cost in blood. Elias saw them because his angle in the garden showed him what the terrace's screening system did not. He saw them because he was a gardener, and gardeners are always looking up at people who never look down. He recognized the envoy's ring. It was a small copper braid. It was worn upside down, which was the old threshold signal for a message being carried. Elias, on the garden path, snipped another dead bloom. He filed the information the way he had once filed a bearing on a target through a gun sight, in a wind he could not see. Vethrak's thumb tapped once against his wrist. 2 weeks later, at the 5th hour of the 3rd day of a month, whose name Elias had never been able to pronounce, the Empress Seravis signed his transfer contract without looking up. She was at breakfast. She was reading a poem her spouse had sent her from the far side of the estate. Vethrak leaned in and murmured something about a favorable tariff on iridium crystal, and about how the Guthari syndicate had specifically requested a piece of Terran ornamentalia to complete a diplomatic exchange, and how the Empress's own gardens were oversubscribed anyway. He suggested a piece. He suggested a piece the Empress would not miss. She signed. She did not read the paragraph that described how the piece would be shipped. She did not read the paragraph that described how the piece would be received. She did not read the line that said the piece was a person named Elias Burke, 41, 3 tours, specialty field fortification under fire, currently deployed as ornamental domestic labor at the estate. That line was not in the contract Vethrak handed her. That line was in the contract Vethrak had drafted the night before. Elias found out when the harvest supervisor came down into the garden that afternoon with a pair of security escorts and a face like a man about to shoot a good dog. She was Guthari. She was young. She apologized to him. She said he was being transferred and it wasn't personal. Elias set down his pruning shears. He looked up once at the terrace where Vethrak was drinking a cup of something clear and looking directly at him. Elias nodded to himself. "Give me a minute," he said. "I want to finish this row." He finished the row. He set the shears in their case. He wrapped the case in a rag. He set the case on the shelf where it belonged. He unhooked the small copper pin from his coveralls, the pin that marked him as staff. He set the pin next to the case. Then he walked unhurried to the escort and let them lead him away. The transport was a Guthari box hauler. He rode in a cell in the 3rd hold. He was not shackled. There was no need. The cell was welded shut, and the cell had no window, and the cell had no light. The Guthari, for all their cruelty, understood that a man in the dark for 9 days will believe he has been dead for a long time. Elias sat in the dark and closed his eyes and made a mental map of the ship. He did it by the vibrations in the deck plates. He listened for the shift of gravity when the vessel translated between drives. He counted crew rotations by the footsteps that passed his cell. By the 3rd day, he knew where the reactor was, where the bridge was, where the atmospheric processor was, and how many people worked each shift. He didn't try to escape. He didn't try because he had a decision to make first, and it was going to take him the rest of the trip. The decision was about a woman he had never met, named Val Burke. Val was his sister. Val ran the number 2 lift at the ore docks in Duluth, on Earth in winter, from a control cab that had been heated by the same failing coil for 7 years. Val was 38. Val had a daughter of 10 who had never been off-world and never wanted to be. Val had not heard from her brother in 4 months because her brother had been busy tending frost lilies in silence on an alien estate and had not thought his silences were dangerous. Val was, in Elias's private accounting, the reason the world worked. He decided in the cold dark of the 3rd hold of a Guthari box hauler that Val was not going to spend the rest of her life not knowing. That was the entire decision. It was very simple. Everything that followed was engineering. The Guthari box hauler arrived at Kurvith Station on the 9th day. Kurvith was a rock. It was a rock the size of a small continent, spinning slowly around an iron star, drilled through with kilometers of tunnel and pressurized with air that tasted at all times of hot metal. and the resigned sweat of 214 prisoners. It was an iridium mine. It was also quietly off the ledgers of 6 sector treaties. The Guthari intake officer was named Threll. Threll was old for a Guthari, which meant that he had killed enough people to be tired of the taste. He had a data slate and a calibration wand and a board expression, and he processed Elias Burke the way he processed a bag of stripped bolts. Threll waved the calibration wand along Elias's arm. The wand was a Guthari standard bone density scanner. It was the same tool Threll used to sort candidates for the deep tunnels, where the load-bearing work required either heavy servos or heavy skeletons. The wand chimed. Then it chimed again. Then the small blue light on the tip stuttered and went yellow, and then went out. Threll looked at the wand. He looked at Elias. He looked at the wand. "It's broken," he said. He said it in Guthari because he did not expect the human to speak Guthari, and because he wanted to hear himself say it out loud so he could believe it. Elias, who had spent 6 years listening to attendants at an alien court and had a functional talent for languages, did not react. Threll replaced the wand. The new wand chimed twice, made a sound Threll had never heard from a calibration wand, and then went completely inert. The screen displayed a reading 3 times the maximum limit of the scale. Threll looked at the readout. The room was quiet. Threll set down the wand. He looked at Elias. He looked at the intake form. He looked at the box that said ornamental domestic labor, Terran male, 41, low threat. And he looked back at Elias. "You're a gardener," he said. Elias considered the question. He considered his sister and the failing heating coil in her control cab and the pin he had set neatly on the shelf. "I was a gardener," he said. Threll processed him through as ornamental domestic labor with a note in the margin. The note said, "Calibration equipment non-functional at time of intake. Recommend rescan." The note was never followed up on. The recommendation was overwritten by the next shift. Threll went off duty and drank himself into a headache and forgot. Elias was assigned to cell block 4, level 6, near the atmospheric processor. He was given a bunk, a ration allotment, and a set of coveralls that were 1 size too small. The Guthari did that on purpose. It kept the prisoners humble. It kept them thinking about how their own bodies did not fit inside the day they had been given. His coveralls were orange. He did not fold them. He wore them. On the first day, he asked politely for maintenance work. He asked the shift boss, who was a Guthari named Ovrek. Ovrek had a good sense of humor for a warden's man. He laughed and said the maintenance rotation was reserved for prisoners with special privileges, and Elias, being new, would have to earn those. He suggested Elias could earn them by lasting 6 months. Elias thanked him and went back to his bunk. On the second day, he asked again. On the third day, Ovrek beat him with a shock baton until Elias stopped asking. It took 3 hits. Elias didn't fall. He simply stopped asking. Ovrek noted that too. He noted it in the report he did not file. He noted it in the private log he kept in his own head. The log every good jailer keeps, the one that says which prisoners look like problems and which prisoners look like weather. Elias was going to be weather. That night, Elias produced the nail. He had taken it from the heel of his own boot on the transport. He had spent 3 days working it loose with his thumbnail in the dark of the 3rd hold. He had spent the first shift at Kurveth pretending it did not exist. He climbed onto his bunk. He turned his face to the wall. In the pale orange light of the emergency panel, he scratched the first mark into the ceramic. It was a vertical line, no taller than his thumbnail. Then above that line, he scratched a word. He did it in the small, tight cursive he had learned as a child in a Duluth grade school. He scratched the word Vethrak. He scratched it very small. He underlined it twice. Then he closed his eyes and went to sleep, because he had learned in his other life that a man who has decided what he wants sleeps well. On the 5th day, Guard Perun was found dead at the base of the drop shaft on level 8. The drop shaft had had a safety bar removed for maintenance a shift earlier, and the maintenance ticket had been closed by an unknown work order. Guard Perun had been drinking. It was ruled an accident. Elias in cell block 4 added a mark to his ceiling and crossed it. The following week, Guard Torin was found dead in the atmospheric processor, having somehow disabled the intake fan safety interlock before crawling inside to investigate a rattle. It was ruled an accident. The Guthari were not, by cultural inclination, given to investigating deaths in the workforce. Dying was what happened to people who could not pay attention. The syndicate was not a charity. Elias added a mark and crossed it. By the end of the 4th week, 11 of the marks on his ceiling had been crossed out. None of them had been guarded closely enough to notice a shadow. None of them had been the sort of people whose deaths inspired investigation. Elias worked slowly. He worked in the seams. He worked in ventilation ducts a Guthari body was too broad to enter, and in maintenance crawlways a Guthari safety inspector had labeled decommissioned. He worked in the places where nobody with authority ever looked. The Guthari had not, in 112 years of running Kurveth Station, ever had a prisoner enter their ventilation. The idea was categorically ridiculous. The vents were not sized for a body. The vents ran through active atmospheric processes. The vents opened onto vertical drops into the mine head. Elias, who at 3 tours had specialized in field fortification under fire in environments averaging -23 Celsius, had a particular understanding of things a normal body could not do. He also had a functional understanding of atmospheric processes, because his mother's failing heating coil had been the same basic architecture, and he had rebuilt it 4 times before he was 15. He did the work at night when the guards changed shifts. He did not do it for revenge. He did not do it out of anger. He did it the way a farmer culls a herd, methodically, one at a time, on a schedule, marking each one off in a book so the numbers stayed honest. Intelligence Officer Queth of the House of Saravis was a Yilkir. She was thin. She had the long, flat eyes of her species and a habit of chewing the inside of her cheek when she read a report that did not make sense. She had been chewing her cheek for a full station day when she finally brought the folder into the Empress's private study. Empress Saravis was reading a report on grain futures. "Majesty," Queth said. She said it in the old form. She only used the old form when she had bad news. "Your gardener." The Empress did not look up. "Which one?" "The Terran one. He was reassigned. He was sold, Majesty, to the Guthari Syndicate for processing." The Empress turned a page. "He was ornamental," she said. "Ornamental staff cycle out." "Majesty," Queth said, and she said it in a voice that made the Empress finally look up. "I've pulled his file." She set the folder on the table. The Empress looked at it. She did not touch it. "I have," she said, "an audience with the Varathi delegation at high hour. With respect, Majesty, read the file." The Empress reached out. She opened the folder. She read the first page. Then she read the second page. Then very slowly she set the folder down. She read it again. "This is a mistake," she said. Her voice was quiet. "It is not a mistake. He is 41. He is 41. He was a gardener. For 6 years, Majesty. Before that, he was a combat engineer in a Terran expeditionary force, 3 tours. His deployments averaged -23 Celsius. His specialty is listed as field fortification under fire. His unit is listed as dissolved 11 years ago." The Empress looked up at her. "Dissolved," she said. "Yes, Majesty. That is a strange word." "Yes, Majesty." There was a silence in the study. Queth watched it. She had, over her long service, catalogued every kind of silence her Empress produced, and this one was new. This one was the kind of silence that happens inside a room when a chair is quietly moved so that a person can sit down. "Queth," said the Empress. She said it slowly. "Read me the entry under specialty again. Field fortification under fire, Majesty. It's a Terran military discipline. The specialists build defensive positions while being actively shot at. They are, by design, the last person standing in a position that was never supposed to hold. It is a discipline with a very high mortality rate. But he survived it. 3 tours. And then he became a gardener." "Yes, Majesty." The Empress rose. She moved to the tall window that overlooked the frost lily beds. She stood there in the pale violet light of a triple sunset, and she looked down for the first time in 6 years. "I sold," she said very slowly, "a combat engineer to a prison mine." "Yes, Majesty." "On the recommendation of Lord Vethrak." "Yes, Majesty." There was a longer silence. "Queth." "Majesty." "Ready the fleet." "Majesty, if I may. The transfer occurred 9 weeks ago. Curveth Station has a documented survival rate of 8% at the 6-month mark. He may already be ready the fleet." Queth bowed. She left the study. Behind her, the Empress stood at the window for a long time, looking at the empty path where a Terran gardener had once knelt with a pair of shears. She was not primarily concerned for the gardener. She was concerned for the fact that she had been used as a weapon. At Curveth Station, that same evening, Warden Colin addressed the population. He did it from the elevated walkway that ran above the main assembly hall. He did it because 7 of his guards had died in 1 week, and he needed to look strong before the panic set in. Warden Colin was a large Guthari. He wore full armor even on the walkway, which was a tell. He carried a plasma staff and a personal shield generator, and he spoke into an amplifier that made his voice fill the hall. "There is," he said, "a shadow among you." The prisoners were assembled below, 214 of them. They stood in their orange coveralls in the bruise-purple light of the hall and did not make a sound. "There is," said Warden Colin, "someone among you who has decided he is going to make trouble. He has, thus far, made trouble in the small hours. He has done it in ways that look like accidents. He believes he is being clever. He is not being clever. He is being weather. And I want you to understand, all of you, that weather does not last on Curveth Station." He paused. He waited for the fear to settle. He was good at his job. He had done this exact speech in this exact hall 31 times over his career. "I am going to give this weather," he said, "one chance to become still. I am going to give the shadow one chance to step forward. If the shadow steps forward tonight, I will personally break every bone in his body and put him in the deep tunnels for the rest of his life. If the shadow does not step forward tonight, I will start executing prisoners at the rate of 1 per hour, chosen at random, until he does." He waited. The prisoners did not move. At the back of the hall, Elias Burke, who had 4 days earlier been assigned to standing formation on the west side because he was the newest inmate, stood with his hands folded neatly in front of him. He watched Warden Colin. He noted the tell of the plasma staff's charge indicator. He noted that the personal shield generator was a Varathi model, not a Guthari one, which meant it had been imported through the same tariff routes that had brought Vetrak's iridium crystal to Kyle Vorath. He noted the specific frequency the amplifier used to boost the warden's voice, and he noted the small pattern by which that frequency modulated when the warden's breath caught. He noted that the warden's breath was catching now. The warden was afraid. Elias felt, very briefly, sorry for him. That night, Guard Beran was found dead in the mess hall, sitting at his usual table with his usual cup of stimulant in his hand. His neck had been broken with such precision that the coroner initially recorded it as a stroke. Warden Colin executed a prisoner at first light. The prisoner was chosen at random. The prisoner's name was Serith, and she had been a chemist on a colony that no longer existed, and she had been serving 8 years for embezzlement. She was 72 years old. Warden Colin did it in the assembly hall, on the platform, in front of the population, with his plasma staff. He did it without ceremony. He did it as a demonstration. The prisoners did not make a sound. At the back of the hall, Elias Burke watched. He did not move. He did not react. He did not visibly breathe. That evening, in cell block 4, he scratched a new name into the ceiling of his bunk above Vethrak's underlined name. He wrote Colin. He did not underline it. Colin was not personal. Colin was cleanup. He also scratched another mark into the wall, one of the small ones, and did not cross it. He looked at it for a long time. Serith, the chemist, the 72-year-old. He closed his eyes and did the math on how many more prisoners would die if he waited too long. He opened his eyes. He was going to have to speak to the population. He did it that night, from the vents. Elias Burke had not, in his life at Curveth Station, spoken to another prisoner. He had eaten alone. He had slept alone. He had received the small kindnesses of the yard, the way one receives a coin from a stranger, with a nod and no memory. He had understood that a friend was a variable, and variables could be tortured, but he understood something else, too. He understood that a population that thinks itself alone can be broken, and a population that thinks itself organized cannot. He crawled through the ventilation of level 6 that night, and at each cell block, at the intake vent that fed the block's air, he spoke. He spoke very quietly. He spoke in the trade pidgin that most of the prisoners shared. His voice, filtered through the ducts, sounded like the station itself talking. "You are not alone," he said. "You will not die tomorrow. There are more of us than there are of them. Wait for the signal. When the atmospheric processor cycles down for maintenance and does not come back up, that is the signal. Do not fight without me. Do not try to run without me. Wait. Trust the shadow. The shadow is on your side." He said it at every intake vent on level 6. He said it at every intake vent on level 7. He said it at every intake vent on level 5, and then he crawled up to level 4 and level 3 and did it there too. By dawn, 214 prisoners had heard the shadow speak. 214 prisoners lay in their bunks and did not move, and did not tell anyone what they had heard, because a hope you speak aloud dies faster than a hope you hold. Warden Colin executed no one at first light. He did it because his chief of security had reported that during the night, a full 60% of the prisoner population had, without any coordination anyone could see, quietly refused their morning rations. The rations were laced. They were always laced. It was how the Guthari kept the tunnels manageable. The prisoners always ate them because prisoners always eat. That morning, they had not. Warden Colin understood, standing in his office at the top of the station, that something had changed under his floor. He did not know what. He did the only thing a professional warden could do. He called in reinforcements. He sent a burst transmission to the Guthari Syndicate Central Office, requesting a full deployment of correctional shock troopers. He rated the situation as urgent. He requested arrival in 72 hours or less. Correctional shock troopers were not guards. They were not correctional. They were the Guthari's answer to the very rare kind of prison unrest that required, in the Syndicate's private phrase, a hard vacuuming. Elias Burke, working in the ducts that same morning, intercepted the outgoing transmission. He read it in the small maintenance node above the communications shack. He read it 3 times. He calculated arrival at Curveth in approximately 68 hours. He did the math. He revised his plan. He was going to need to move much faster than he had wanted to. Meanwhile, in the flagship of the House of Saravis fleet, the Empress was 2 days out from Curveth Station and going through her own private accounting. She was in her private cabin. She had not slept. She had spent the previous night reading and rereading again the full file on Elias Burke that Keth had assembled. She had read the entries under specialty. She had read the entries under commendations. She had read the private entry that Queth had appended in her own hand, marked confidential, which said, Terran high-gravity trained skeletal structure, Calibration exceeds Guthari standard equipment tolerance. Threat classification revised from low to indeterminate pending contact. She read the word indeterminate again. The Empress had not, in her 418 years of life, ever seen an intelligence report use the word indeterminate. Intelligence reports classified things. That was their function. When they did not classify a thing, it was because the thing was still moving and had not yet held still long enough to be measured. Elias Burke was still moving. The Empress sat with that thought. She had also, in the same night, learned that Lord Vethrak had, immediately after the transfer contract was signed, boarded a private shuttle and travelled by an indirect route to a threshold sympathizer meeting on the neutral moon of Bathris. She had learned that at the meeting, Vethrak had spoken for 3 hours behind closed doors. She had learned that he had returned to court the next morning smiling. She had learned, in short, that she had been used. She had also learned, at some deeper and older level, that she had allowed herself to be used because she had not been paying attention to a piece of her own house. That thought stung her worse than the first one. She stood, and she walked to the small altar in her cabin where her mother's icons sat, and she said quietly and privately, "I am sorry. I will fix it." She said it in the old form. She meant it in the old form. Then she went to the bridge and asked Queth for the fleet's expected arrival time. 51 hours, Majesty. That is too long. That is the fastest jump we can safely make with the full fleet. Then we will make an unsafe jump. Majesty, Queth, make the unsafe jump. Queth bowed. She gave the order. The fleet's estimated arrival advanced to 39 hours. At Curvith Station, Elias Burke was building a bomb. He was doing it out of hydraulic fluid, an old lubricant reservoir, a coil of scavenged wire, and the timer from a broken chronometer. He was doing it in the dark, in a decommissioned maintenance crawlway above the atmospheric processor. He was doing it with the calm, efficient patience of a man who has done this kind of work in worse rooms. The bomb was not the plan. The bomb was the distraction that would enable the plan. The plan was very simple. Elias had spent 8 weeks mapping the station. He knew where the control room was. He knew where the warden's private overrides lived. He knew where the master atmospheric interlock was and how to jam it open. He knew where the docking clamp release for the guard shuttle was, and he knew, most importantly, where the Guthari kept the master roster of correctional shock trooper deployment codes. The plan was to seize the control room, seize the roster, and use the roster to send a cancellation order to the incoming shock troopers under the warden's own authorization key. The plan was to buy the population enough time to be found alive when the House of Saravis fleet inevitably worked out where its gardener had gone. Elias assumed the fleet was coming. He had done that math weeks earlier. He knew Queth. He had catalogued her the way he catalogued everyone. She was the sort of intelligence officer who would eventually check paperwork out of pure boredom. He also assumed that the fleet was not coming fast enough. He assumed correctly. He worked through the night. In the morning he had a bomb that would, when it went off in the atmospheric processor's overflow tank, produce a very loud noise, no meaningful damage, and precisely the visual signature the Guthari central alarm would classify as a reactor breach. The Guthari would evacuate the guards to the control room. They would seal the levels. They would engage the emergency lockdown. That was what Elias needed. He needed all 40 guards in one room. At the 9th hour of the 3rd day of that week, in the private cell where he slept, a young prisoner named Iriel woke Elias by touching his arm. Iriel was 17. Iriel was a Kryn, a lizard-like species from a small colony that had been swept up by the Syndicate. Iriel spoke passable trade pidgin. "Shadow," Iriel whispered. Elias opened his eyes. "I am asked to bring you something." Iriel held out his hand. In it was a scrap of ration wrapper folded once. Elias took it. He unfolded it. On it, in the neat, small script of a Kryn hand, was a message. They know it is you. They will come for you before dawn. Move. Elias read it twice. He looked up at Iril. Who gave you this? A woman, Iril said. She said her name was Marin. Elias knew Marin. Marin was a mid-block prisoner, quiet, injured leg, worked in the mess. He had, 3 weeks earlier, given her half his ration when her leg had gone bad. He had, at the time, catalogued her as safe. He had catalogued her as safe because a woman with a bad leg cannot betray you, and a woman he had helped once would remember. He had been wrong. Elias sat up. He looked at Iril. He looked at the note. He looked at the ceiling of his bunk where 29 marks were crossed out and 11 were not. Iril, he said, did you tell anyone else about this note? No, Shadow. Did anyone see her give it to you? No. Did anyone follow you here? No, Shadow. I was careful. Elias considered. You are a good boy, he said. Do you know how to get to the mess hall through the service ducts? Yes. Go there now. Wait behind the pot rack. Do not come out. If anyone comes for you, tell them the Shadow said it was time. They will know what to do. Yes, Shadow. Iril slipped away. He was gone in 3 heartbeats. Elias sat on the edge of his bunk in the pale orange light and worked out the shape of the betrayal Marin had informed. Marin was not a threshold plant, because a threshold plant would not be in a Guthari prison mine in the first place. Marin was Guthari. Marin was probably a Guthari plant who had been embedded on the station months or years earlier to sniff out exactly this kind of thing. Which meant Warden Colin had known Elias's identity for a long time. Which meant Warden Colin had been letting him kill guards. Which meant Warden Colin wanted to see how far he'd go. Which meant Warden Colin was not going to arrest him at dawn. Warden Colin was going to try to kill him now. The door to Elias's cell blew inward on its hinges 11 seconds after he finished that thought. 6 Guthari guards came through the doorway in armored breach formation, plasma staves lowered, personal shields active. They moved efficiently. They moved as if they had trained for this. Elias was already at the ventilation grate. He was through it before the second guard cleared the threshold. They fired the plasma staves after him. The bolts scored the walls of the ventilation shaft. He was already 3 meters up and moving. He heard, over the pursuing footsteps, Warden Colin's voice on the internal loop. He's in the vents, level 6. Flush him out. Bring me his body. I want it in the assembly hall by dawn. Elias, moving up a shaft that no Guthari body could enter, permitted himself a small, grim smile. The problem was that Colin had moved his timeline. The bomb wasn't ready. The distraction wasn't primed. The population wasn't warned. He was going to have to improvise. He improvised. He came down out of the vents into the atmospheric processor room. He caught the on-duty maintenance guard from behind and choked him unconscious in the time it took the man to reach for his sidearm. He stole the sidearm. He stole the keycard. He shut the manual override on the atmospheric processor, jammed it with the guard's own baton, and pulled the emergency vent that redirected all filtered air away from the guard barracks and toward the mine tunnels. The station's alarm began to sound. Elias moved. He moved through the maintenance corridor with the sidearm in his good hand and his other hand pressed against his ribs, because on the way through the vent he had scraped his side against a bracket and torn open a long, deep gash that was bleeding freely into his coveralls. He would deal with that later. He came around the corner into the main corridor of level 6 and met 3 guards coming the other way. He shot 2 of them. The third one raised a plasma staff and fired. The first plasma bolt caught Elias in the left shoulder. He went down. He got up. He crossed the distance to the third guard in 4 steps that should have been impossible for a man with a hole through his shoulder. He caught the plasma staff with his good hand and drove the butt of it into the guard's throat, and the guard went down and did not get up. Elias stood in the corridor breathing. There was a silence around him that felt like a held breath. He looked at the plasma burn in his shoulder. It had cauterized itself. He could smell burning coverall and something sweeter underneath that he knew was his own tissue. He kept moving. He came to the assembly hall by the maintenance route. He entered by the platform door, behind the walkway where the warden gave his speeches. He came out on the walkway. Below him, the prisoners were being herded into the hall by armed guards. There were about a dozen guards on the floor. There were more coming. Elias stood on the walkway and looked down. The prisoners saw him. 214 faces in the pale purple light of the assembly hall, all turned up toward him at once. He said, in trade pidgin, in the voice that carried without amplification because he had learned in 3 tours how to make himself heard without a mic, "It is time." The guards on the floor turned. The prisoners did not. The prisoners moved. 214 prisoners in a coordinated wave went for the 12 guards on the floor. Some of them died in the first 5 seconds. Most of them did not. Elias, on the walkway, brought up the plasma staff and shot the first reinforcement guard through the doorway before the man had cleared the threshold. Then he shot the second one. Then he was out of charge. He dropped the staff. He picked up a length of iron pipe he had left on the walkway 3 days earlier for this exact reason. A piece of pipe bent off a decommissioned maintenance hatch, and he went down the stairs. The next 20 minutes were not, in any strict sense, a battle. They were an argument between a very old idea about what a body could do and a very young idea about what a body was for. Warden Collins' guards had plasma staves and personal shields and body armor rated for kinetic and thermal impact. They had training. They had numbers. Elias Burke had an iron pipe and a very specific piece of information. The piece of information was that a personal shield generator has a small aperture in the back of the wearer's helmet for cooling. The aperture is invisible from the front. It cannot be plated over because if you plate it over, the generator overheats and stops working. Every Verathi model and every model licensed from Verathi had one, and every Guthari on Kurveth was wearing a Verathi model shield. Elias had catalogued this 3 weeks earlier by watching a guard scratch the back of his own neck through the aperture during a slow shift. He put the pipe through the aperture on the first guard he reached. The pipe went in. The guard went down. The shield deactivated with a small, polite chime. The next guard fired his plasma staff at Elias at point-blank range. The bolt caught Elias in the left thigh. He went down. He got up. He got up because there was a woman named Val Burke in a control cab in Duluth who was going to spend the rest of her life not knowing, and he had decided 6 months earlier, in the dark of a Guthari box hauler, that she was not going to spend her life not knowing. And he had done all of the engineering he could to make sure of it, and there was one piece of engineering left, which was that he had to still be alive at the end of this hour. And he was going to be. He got up. He killed the second guard with the pipe. He killed the third guard with the second guard's plasma staff. He killed the fourth guard by driving him headfirst into the floor of the assembly hall. By the time he reached the far end of the hall, both of his hands were slick with blood, most of it his own. The plasma wound in his shoulder had reopened. The wound in his thigh was worse. He was leaving a trail on the floor. He didn't stop. He didn't stop because the 214 prisoners were behind him now, and they had picked up plasma staves off dead guards, and they were moving, and the sound of them moving was the loudest sound in Elias Burke's private accounting because it was the sound of 214 people choosing to stand. They went through the station like weather. They took level 6, they took level 7, they took the mess hall, they took the maintenance bays. Elias, in the vanguard, killed guards with the pipe and with plasma staves and with his hands, and behind him the prisoners moved through the levels like a tide that had waited 9 weeks to break, and Kurveth Station belonged, corridor by corridor, to the population. They reached the control room at the 3rd hour after dawn. Warden Collin was inside. He had barricaded the door. He had 6 guards with him. He had disabled the ventilation to try to force Elias to come in slow. Elias did not come in slow. He came in through the ceiling. The ceiling of the control room had a service hatch that Colin had never noticed, because Colin had never once looked up in the control room in his entire career as warden. The hatch opened into a maintenance crawl space that connected to the ventilation system Elias had spent 9 weeks mapping. Elias dropped through the hatch onto the floor of the control room with the plasma staff in one hand and the pipe in the other, and he broke the 6 guards in something under 9 seconds. He did not remember the exact number of seconds later. It felt like a very short time. It also felt like a very long time. When it was done, only Warden Colin was still standing. Colin had his own plasma staff in his hand. He was pressed against the wall. He was afraid. His breath was catching. Elias stood in the middle of the control room and lowered the pipe. "Warden Colin," he said. Colin did not answer. "I need one thing from you." Colin swallowed. "I need the deployment codes for the shock troopers you called in." Colin looked at him. "You're going to die," Colin said. It was not a threat, it was a question. It was the question of a man who has just realized that all of his assumptions about the world are wrong. "Not today," said Elias. "The codes." Colin gave him the codes. Elias entered the codes into the console. He sent the cancellation order over Colin's own authorization key. He watched the confirmation reply come back from the Syndicate's central office. Shock trooper deployment aborted. Standing down. He looked at Warden Cullen. Warden Cullen looked at him. "Sit down," said Elias in a voice that was, all of a sudden, very tired. Cullen sat down. Elias limped to the warden's own chair. He sat in it. He looked at his ceiling, at the marks on the ceiling of his bunk in cell block 4 that were not physically here, but that he could see, and he mentally crossed out every one that was not yet crossed. He mentally left Vethrak's name uncrossed. Vethrak was not here. Vethrak was going to have to wait. He looked at Warden Colin, who was sitting on the floor in the corner and shaking. "Colin," he said, "you knew what I was." "Yes." "You knew when I got here?" "Yes." "How?" "The intake wand," Colin said. "The report. Threll filed a marker. I saw it. I checked the file." "You had my whole file?" "Yes." "You knew I was a combat engineer?" "Yes." "And you let me kill your guards for 6 weeks?" Colin was silent for a long time. "I wanted to see," he said finally, "how many you'd get. I wanted to see the number." Elias looked at him. "Colin, who told you to let me kill them?" Colin looked at the floor. "Lord Vethrak." There was a silence in the control room. It was the kind of silence that people mean when they say the word silence. "Vethrak sent you word to let me kill your guards." "Yes." "Because?" "Because when the House of Saravis fleet arrived, he needed the station to have failed. He needed the Empress to see her gardener at the top of a mountain of bodies. He needed her to see what she had done. He needed her to be broken by it." Elias did the math. Vethrak had not, when he had sold Elias to the Guthari, been trying to murder Elias. Vethrak had been trying to break Empress Saravis. Vethrak had used Elias as the wedge. Vethrak had counted on Elias's competence to make the story big enough to matter. Vethrak had counted on the Empress being made to feel, in front of her whole court, that she had committed an unforgivable moral crime by treating a person as a line item. Vethrak had counted on the resulting political weakness to open the House of Saravis to a threshold coup. Vethrak had used Elias as a bomb. Vethrak had, in fact, used Elias as an extremely effective bomb. Elias closed his eyes for one long, slow moment. Then he opened them. He looked at the console. He looked at the log. He composed a message. He composed it in the clean prose he had learned in his first tour, when he had been the youngest field engineer in his unit and had been made to write his own casualty reports. The message was addressed to Intelligence Officer Queth of the House of Seravis. It carried Kerveth Station's own authorization key. It read as follows: Station secured. 214 freed. 40 guards restrained. Lord Vethrak of Vereth is authoritative party of interest. Recommend detention on arrival, Elias Burke. He sent it. He sat back in the warden's chair. He looked at the wound in his thigh, which was still bleeding. He picked up the warden's own emergency medical kit from the drawer under the console. He opened it. He put the muzzle of the warden's cauterizing wand against the entry wound in his thigh, closed his teeth against the pain, and pulled the trigger. The room filled with the smell of burnt meat. Warden Colin in the corner made a soft sound. Elias in the chair did the shoulder next. Then he closed the kit and set it back in the drawer, and sat and breathed. He was still sitting there, in the warden's chair, eating a ration bar he had taken from the warden's own drawer, 23 hours later, when the House of Seravis fleet arrived, and Empress Seravis herself came through the airlock. She came in personally. She did not send an emissary. She came in a light armored suit and with only 2 attendants, Queth and a bodyguard. Because she had already sent orders to the fleet to secure the outside of the station and had decided that she was going to look her gardener in the face herself. She had not, in her 418 years, ever done a thing like this personally. She walked the corridors of Kerveth Station. She walked past the 214 freed prisoners who lined the walls, standing in silent salute. She walked past the 40 Guthari guards, each of them restrained neatly with lengths of repurposed irrigation hose, arranged in an orderly row along the wall of the receiving bay. She walked past the maintenance jumpsuit flag on the primary communications mast, which someone had raised at Elias's quiet suggestion 2 days earlier as a signal to any incoming ally. She walked into the control room. Elias Burke was in the warden's chair. He was in a set of coveralls, one size too small, torn and blood-soaked. He had a wound in his shoulder that had been cauterized with a warden's wand. He had a wound in his thigh that had been done the same way. His hands were bandaged with strips torn from his own sleeve. He was eating a Guthari ration bar. Warden Colin sat on the floor in the corner, unrestrained but wholly still, watching the door. Elias saw the Empress enter. He did not stand. Behind the Empress, Intelligence Officer Queth made a small sound. The estate's translation matrix later would not be able to classify the sound. It was not surprise. It was not grief. It was something older and quieter that had no direct rendering in trade pidgin. It was the sound of a professional who has just seen the shape of something that has spent 9 weeks assembling itself in her blind spot. The Empress crossed the room. She stopped in front of the warden's chair. She looked down at her gardener. He looked up at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The Empress lowered herself, slowly to one knee. She did it with the ancient formal grace of a matriarch acknowledging a debt. She did it in front of Queth, in front of Warden Colin, in front of her own bodyguard, in front of the recording feed that would carry this moment to her court within the hour. "Elias Burke of Terror," she said in the old form. "I owe you an accounting." Elias looked at her. He chewed his ration bar. He swallowed. "East Quadrant soil," he said. The Empress blinked. Her long flat eyes narrowed. "East Quadrant soil? Wrong pH. I told the head gardener twice. Nobody wrote it down. I want it acknowledged in writing before I go back." There was a silence in the control room. Queth, behind the Empress, made the sound again. The translation matrix, later, would not be able to classify that one either. The Empress rose, very slowly. "Elias Burke," she said. "You are—" "Ma'am," said Elias, "before you say anything else, Lord Vethrak is on your ship. Warden Colin has confirmed his direct involvement. He set this up to fracture your court. I don't know how many people around you he owns. I recommend you have him restrained before you leave this room." The Empress stood and looked at him and did not move for one full breath. Then she turned to Queth. Queth. Majesty. Detain Lord Vethrak. Yes, Majesty. Queth left the room. Her footsteps went fast down the corridor. The Empress turned back to Elias. Terran, she said, you could have escaped this station in the first week. Yes, ma'am. You could have escaped and returned to your own space and been safe. Yes, ma'am. You did not. No, ma'am. Why? Elias considered the question. He looked at his bloody hand. He looked at the Empress. He looked at the ceiling. There's 214 people on this rock, he said. I couldn't take them all in a lifeboat. The Empress looked at him. That is your reason. That's my reason. There is nothing else. Elias thought about Val in the control cab in Duluth in winter. He thought about the failing heating coil. He thought about the pin he had left on the shelf in the garden shed. Mum, he said, if you want to do something for me, I have a sister in Duluth, on Earth, Val Burke. She runs the number 2 lift at the ore docks. She doesn't know I'm alive. I'd like her to know. The Empress looked at him for a long moment. She will know, she said, and Duluth will know, and the ore docks in winter will not be cold again. Elias almost smiled. He almost did. Ma'am, he said, 1 coil, that's all she needs, nothing fancy. The Empress bowed her head once in the old formal way. Behind her, in the corner, Warden Colin looked at Elias with something like awe. Elias looked back at him. Colin, he said, you did tell me the truth. That's worth something. When the Empress's people come for you, tell them I said that. They'll understand what it means. Colin swallowed. He nodded. Elias leaned back in the warden's chair. He was, he realized, going to have to be carried out. His thigh was not going to walk. He closed his eyes. Ma'am, he said, 1 more thing. Yes, when you have Vethrak, when you have him in front of you, ask him to explain the Bathurst meeting. He'll try to deny it. Don't let him. There's a woman there, an envoy with a copper braid worn upside down. She's Threshold. Vethrak spoke to her before he came to your court. He does the thing with his left thumb when he lies. He taps his right wrist. He does it every time. He'll do it when you ask him. The Empress nodded once. Ask him, Elias said, on the record, in front of your whole court, because that's the part that matters, not the trial, the court. The court needs to see him do it. The Empress looked at Elias for a long time. She looked at him as if she was, for the first time in 6 years, understanding what she had been sitting above. Elias Burke, she said quietly, you have been thinking about my court. Ma'am, he said, I've been thinking about it since the day I saw Vethrak. I had time. She looked at him. You, she said, were pruning frost lilies. Yes, ma'am. You were pruning frost lilies and thinking about my court. Ma'am, that was my job. I was thinking about the beds. But when I was thinking about the beds, I was also thinking about the court. It's what I do. I can't turn it off. I never could. That's why I stopped doing it professionally, ma'am. I wanted to do a job where I could stop. The Empress reached out, very slowly. She put her hand on his shoulder, on the wounded one. She did it with such gentleness that it did not hurt. You could not stop, she said. No, ma'am. It turns out I couldn't. I am sorry. Yes, ma'am. I am truly sorry. I know, ma'am. I saw you come through that door. You came in person. That means something. The Empress bowed her head again. This time it was not the old formal bow. It was a different bow, one Queth would later say she had never seen the Empress use. Then she straightened. She was, once again, the Empress. Elias Burke, she said, when you are healed, when you have been to Terra, when you have seen your sister and seen your ore docks and eaten a bad Terran coffee and had a good sleep, there will be a place for you in my house, a real place, with real responsibility. You will not be ornamental. Elias looked at her. He thought about it. "Ma'am," he said finally, "with respect, I will consider it, but I have terms." The Empress inclined her head. "Speak them." 1. The East Quadrant soil gets fixed in writing before I come back. Done. 2. Val gets the coil, also in writing, also before. Done. 3. He paused. He looked at her. "The next time somebody like Vethrak walks into your court and asks you to sign a piece of paper, ma'am, you read the paragraph on how it ships. You read every paragraph. You look up from your tea." The Empress was quiet. She looked at him for a very long moment. "Done," she said, very softly. 4, he said. "Yes. I don't wash windows." There was a silence in the control room. Then Queth, coming back through the door with 2 guards behind her, and Lord Vethrak in Varathi silks restrained between them, stopped and looked at Elias, and made the sound for the 3rd time. The estate's translation matrix 3 years later would still not be able to classify the sound. It was catalogued eventually in a private appendix to Queth's own personal file, under a header the matrix had generated on its own and never fully explained. The header read simply, "Laughter." They took Vethrak to trial. It was public. It was in the Great Hall of the House of Seravis, and it was broadcast live and unedited to every court in the 3rd Reach. The Empress presided in person. She wore the old formal robes. She asked Lord Vethrak on the record in front of her whole court to explain the meeting on Bathris. Lord Vethrak, in his fine Varathi silks, drew himself up and denied it. His left thumb tapped, once, against his right wrist. The Empress saw it. Everyone in the court saw it. The recording, which would circulate through the sector for the next 4 decades, showed it in high resolution. Lord Vethrak's plot fell apart in an afternoon. The Threshold faction, deprived of the political fracture Vethrak had spent 2 years engineering, collapsed within a season. The House of Seravis, in the 6 months following, quietly restructured its intake procedures for domestic labor. Every existing staff member was reassessed. 6 were promoted. 4 were released with pensions. 2 were quietly identified as other people's agents and let go. The estate's translation matrix was updated to flag anomalies in intake documentation. Empress Seravis, for the rest of her long life, read every paragraph. 2 years after the trial, on a quiet morning in the frost lily beds of Kailvorath, a man in a set of pale grey coveralls knelt to inspect a young bloom in the East Quadrant. His hair had gone whiter at the temples. He walked with a slight limp on his left side. He carried at his belt a pair of pruning shears in a leather case that had been made for him personally by a Duluth cobbler. He whistled quietly. It was a song his mother had whistled in the mornings before the winter came. Above him on the terrace, the Empress Seravis was taking counsel. She did not look down. She had, however, that morning before the council began, sent down a small handwritten note that said, in the neat trade pigeon she had personally learned to write in the past year, "The East Quadrant soil is at correct pH per your specification, and I acknowledge, on the record, that you told me twice." Elias Burke had read it. He had folded it into quarters. He had put it in the leather case with the shears. He had gone back to work. 100 meters away, in a maintenance annex that had once been a decorative outbuilding, there was a small office. It was clean, it was quiet. It had a comfortable chair and a desk and a wall of small screens that showed feeds from every corridor of the estate and every corridor of the 6 adjacent estates and every arrival hall in the 3rd Reach. There was a nameplate on the desk. It read, "Advisor for Interior Security." Elias did not spend much time at the desk. He spent his mornings in the garden. He spent his afternoons at the desk. He wore, when he was at the desk, the same pale grey coveralls he wore in the garden. He did not at any time wash a window. On the wall behind the desk, framed in plain estate wood, was a small piece of paper. It was a message on ration wrapper folded once. It said, in the neat small script of a Kryn hand, "They know it is you. They will come for you before dawn. Move." The Kryn who had written it, a young man named Iril, worked in the estate kitchen. He had a room of his own. He was learning to grow frost lilies. He liked the work. On a shelf in Elias's office, next to a battered mug of the worst Terran coffee that could be shipped through 6 jumps, sat a small brass pin. It was the pin of an estate labourer. It had been on the shelf in the garden shed for 6 months, waiting for him. He had put it back on the day he came home. He wore it at all times on the collar of his coveralls. And every evening, when the third sun went down over the frost lily beds, Elias Burke sat in the doorway of his office and had a cup of very bad coffee and looked out at the garden and thought about his sister in Duluth in a control cab with a new heating coil, and thought about a mountain of bodies on a rock around an iron star, and thought about how a life sometimes bends around you until you find yourself, gently and by accident, home. What a journey. What a way to end it. The truest weapon in the galaxy is not the plasma bolt or the shield, not the empire or the fleet. The truest weapon is a stubborn, quiet man who has decided that someone he loves is not going to spend her life not knowing. If you loved this story, leave your like. It is what keeps these tales alive in the dark. Share it with someone who also loves science fiction about one human against the impossible. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss the next HFY epic. And here is the question for you tonight in the comments. If you were the Empress at that final trial, would you have hired Elias to rebuild the security of your entire house, or would you have taken the money and gone home to Duluth with him? Choose one and tell us why. Keep your eyes on the empty spaces between the stars. That is where the quiet ones live.